60 journalists packed into that conference room, cameras clicking, recorders running, pens scratching across notepads. Everyone was waiting for Clint Eastwood to answer. The question hanging in the air wasn't journalism, it was a grenade designed to humiliate. Most people expected the Hollywood legend to lose his composure. Maybe fire back with something sharp. Maybe walk out entirely. What he did instead, with just 18 words, would destroy a young reporter's career and become the most studied moment in journalism schools for the next 3 decades. April 1992. Beverly Wilshire Hotel, Los Angeles. Clint Eastwood sat at a table promoting his upcoming Western, Unforgiven. He was 61 years old, and certain critics had already started writing his professional obituary. Too old. Out of touch. A relic clinging to genres that audiences had supposedly abandoned. The press event had the usual energy publicists hovering at the edges, reporters jockeying for position, the controlled chaos of a major studio promotion. Clint had been fielding questions for roughly 40 minutes, handling them with the same economical precision he brought to his directing. Brief answers, no wasted words, the occasional half-smile that never quite reached his eyes. Then a hand shot up from the third row. The young man's name was Michael Bradford, 28 years old. He wrote for one of those entertainment magazines that positioned itself as fearless and provocative, the kind of publication that measured success by how many celebrities they could antagonize. Michael had cultivated a small reputation for asking the questions nobody else would ask, though a more accurate description might be the questions nobody else wanted to ask because they served no purpose beyond generating conflict. He was ambitious. He was confident. He was about to step on a landmine. The publicist pointed in his direction. Michael stood, recorder held high, and there was something in his posture, a certain swagger that made several veteran journalists exchange glances. They'd encountered this species before. Young, hungry, convinced that taking down an icon was the fastest route to building a name. "Mr. Eastwood," Michael began, voice carrying clearly through the room, "your new film centers on an aging gunfighter attempting one final job. Some might call that autobiographical." He paused. "Let the implications settle. At your age, don't you think it's time to step aside for younger, more relevant filmmakers? Aren't you just recycling the same exhausted Western formulas that modern audiences have moved past?" The room went silent. Not the normal pause that separates question from answer. Something deeper. The uncomfortable silence of witnesses watching an accident unfold in slow motion. Several reporters actually turned in their seats to look at Michael, as if confirming that he'd genuinely just said what they thought he'd said. The publicist's professional smile collapsed into barely concealed horror. Clint didn't move. He studied Michael with those famous pale blue eyes, the same eyes that had stared down outlaws in 100 different westerns. His expression revealed nothing. No anger, no surprise. Just a long, steady gaze that seemed to extend into infinity. 5 seconds passed. 10. 15. The silence became almost physically uncomfortable. Michael began shifting his weight. His confidence was cracking, you could see it happening in real time. He'd anticipated a defensive reaction he could write about. Maybe an angry outburst that would become a headline. Instead, he was receiving nothing but that unwavering stare. Finally, Clint leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped on the table in front of him. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but perfectly clear, every word landing with deliberate precision. "Son, if you have to explain why your question is clever, it probably isn't." That was it. 18 words. The room didn't erupt in applause or laughter. It was more like a collective exhalation. 60 people simultaneously releasing breath they didn't realize they'd been holding. Several veteran journalists actually smiled, recognizing a masterclass in dismantling someone without raising your voice. The publicist's expression shifted to something between relief and quiet amazement. And Michael Bradford's face went from confident to ashen in approximately 2 seconds. But Clint wasn't finished. He leaned back in his chair, completely relaxed, and continued in that same measured tone. "I've been making films since before you were born. I've collaborated with actors and directors whose names you probably encountered in whatever film school you attended. And across those decades, I've learned something important." He paused, not for dramatic effect, but as if genuinely weighing his next words. The people who talk most about relevance are usually the ones most anxious about their own. The silence that followed was different now. Not uncomfortable, respectful. Clint had just delivered a tutorial in responding to disrespect without descending to its level. Michael dropped into his seat. His face flushed crimson. He fumbled with his recorder, attempting to become invisible. Around him, other journalists were carefully avoiding eye contact the way people do when someone has just publicly humiliated themselves. The publicist, recognizing an opportunity to restore momentum, quickly pointed to another reporter. But something had fundamentally shifted in that room. The questions that followed were more thoughtful, more professional. Clint had reminded everyone present that there's a distinction between tough journalism and performance art. Here's where the story extends beyond that conference room. Michael Bradford exited the Beverly Wilshire, thinking he'd survived. Sure, he'd been put in his place, but he had his quote, right? He could still compose his provocative piece, frame himself as the fearless journalist willing to challenge Hollywood's sacred cows. That evening, in his hotel room, laptop open, he tried to write the article. Every angle he attempted collapsed. Every attempt to spin the exchange in his favor made him look worse. The problem was fundamental. Clint's response had been perfect measured, wise, impossible to criticize, and Michael's question had been exactly what it appeared to be, shallow provocation disguised as journalism. He filed the article anyway. It ran 3 days later with the headline, "Aging Eastwood Defends Western Formula." Michael attempted to frame it as a story about Hollywood's resistance to evolution, about veteran directors clinging to outdated glory. He made one critical miscalculation. He included the complete exchange, including Clint's response. The reaction was immediate and devastating. Within hours, the story had inverted. Entertainment websites picked it up, but not the way Michael had anticipated. The headlines read, "Reporter gets masterclass from Clint Eastwood," and journalist's provocative question backfires spectacularly. Other journalists, including several who'd witnessed the exchange firsthand, wrote their own analyses. They discussed professionalism. They examined the boundary between holding powerful people accountable and being disrespectful for attention. Michael's name became synonymous with what not to do in a press setting. His editor called 2 days after publication. The conversation was brief and terminal. The magazine was receiving complaints from publicists, from fellow journalists, from readers. Multiple studios had called to express concerns about their relationship with the publication if Michael continued representing them at events. "You made us look amateur," his editor said. "You made yourself the story instead of reporting it. And worse, you handed Clint Eastwood the moral high ground. That's not journalism. That's ego with a press credential." Michael was removed from the entertainment beat. 3 weeks later, he was removed from the publication entirely. The official explanation was restructuring. Everyone understood the truth. He attempted to freelance but discovered that previously open doors had sealed shut. Publicists remembered his name. Other journalists remembered the incident. In an industry constructed on relationships and trust, he'd demolished his credibility with one question and 18 words of response. The final blow arrived 6 months later. Unforgiven was released to overwhelming critical acclaim. It collected 4 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Director for Clint Eastwood. At 62, Clint had demonstrated precisely what he'd stated in that press conference. Relevance isn't determined by age. It's determined by quality. Michael Bradford eventually abandoned journalism entirely. Last anyone heard, he'd transitioned to corporate communications, far removed from the spotlight he'd once pursued. His professional legacy, which he'd once carefully curated, now features the Clint Eastwood incident as its primary entry. Meanwhile, Clint Eastwood continued directing for another 3 decades. He helmed critically, celebrated films, accumulated additional awards, and proved repeatedly that craft and talent don't carry expiration dates. He never publicly mentioned the incident again. He didn't need to. The exchange became required study in journalism programs. Professors used it as a case study in how ego can destroy credibility, how the most effective responses to provocation are often the quietest ones. Students watched the footage, analyzing Clint's calm demeanor, his measured words, his refusal to be drawn into conflict. Journalists who witnessed that day still discuss it. They describe the moment as a demonstration of composure, a reminder that genuine authority doesn't need to raise its voice. One veteran reporter who'd been covering Hollywood for 4 decades summarized it perfectly. "I've observed actors lose their temper at press events. I've watched them walk out. I've seen them deliver rambling, defensive monologues. What I'd never witnessed until that afternoon was someone dismantle a provocateur using wisdom and restraint." Clint didn't destroy that young man. He offered him an opportunity to learn something valuable. The young man chose to ignore it. The incident influenced how an entire generation of journalists approached their work. Some internalized it as a lesson about professionalism. Others recognized it as a warning against confusing controversy with courage. The best understood that holding powerful people accountable doesn't require disrespect, and that the most effective questions emerge from genuine curiosity, not from hunger for conflict. For Clint, it was probably just another press event in a career filled with thousands. He'd fielded difficult questions before. He'd field them again. But his response that day became part of his legacy, another example of the quiet strength that defined both his screen presence and his actual character. The phrase, "if you have to explain why your question is clever, it probably isn't," entered the informal vocabulary of journalism. It appeared on T-shirts worn by communications students. It surfaced in articles about interview technique. It became shorthand for a simple truth: substance outweighs style, and respect outweighs attention. Today, if you search Michael Bradford's name, the Clint Eastwood incident remains the primary result. More than 30 years have passed, but the internet preserves everything. The footage has accumulated millions of views. The comment section overflows with analysis. Clint's composure, Michael's visible disintegration, the palpable shift in the room's atmosphere. The lesson from that April afternoon in 1992 isn't complicated. It's not about age or relevance or even journalism specifically. It's about character. It's about understanding that your response to disrespect reveals more about you than the disrespect itself. It's about recognizing that authentic confidence doesn't need to diminish others to prove itself. Clint Eastwood delivered that lesson in 18 words. Michael Bradford absorbed it with his career. And everyone in that room, along with millions who've watched the footage since, got to witness what happens when quiet dignity collides with calculated provocation. The question was designed to embarrass an aging actor. Instead, it illuminated the chasm between someone who'd earned respect through decades of work and someone attempting to claim significance through cheap conflict. One sentence. That's all it required to make that difference absolutely clear. If this story delivered value, that subscribe button is waiting. We're excavating these moments. Hollywood doesn't discuss the exchanges that reveal character. Drop a comment. Have you ever witnessed someone defuse hostility with composure instead of conflict? And if you want to hear what happened when a different journalist tried a similar approach with Clint years later, only to receive a response that was somehow even more devastating, tell me in the comments. Because some people never learn the lesson Michael Bradford taught the rest of us.